end of the semester, because we've only got 2 weeks left. We've only got this week and next week left.
Yeah.
So I kind of retyped the last couple of weeks of the syllabus. I'm going to post that after class. So I'll go ahead and share that with you, just so that everybody knows where we're going and what we're doing. So this is all we have left, right? Today is 12/8, and what I'll do is I'll lecture on the respiratory system. And then in that biological kit that you guys got, there's a respiratory physiology lab. And so I'll have that due next Wednesday. We should do that between now and next Wednesday. And so I posted that on Moodle as well, in a place where you can post the answers to that. And then on Friday, we'll meet and we'll go over the digestive system. And then the next lab, the lab for that will be the pig dissection. So at some point next week, I'd like you to do the pig dissection. I have to set up a schedule, a place where you can upload pictures of the pig. And then next week, the 15th and the 17th, we'll go over the urinary and reproductive systems. And what I'll do is I'll post the final exam after next Friday's class, so after the 17th, and it'll be due before the 22nd. And that will be on chapters 15, 16, 18, and 19. So rather than doing these two and having an exam and then these two and having an exam, we're just going to have an exam on all four, just because we're running so short on time, right? And the two labs that we'll have, the respiratory physiology lab, which correlates really well with the respiratory system, and the pig dissection, where you can see a lot of the digestive, the urinary, reproductive structures in the pig. Does that make sense?
All righty.
So I'll send out an email. I'll post this, make sure that, everybody's on the same page. And what we are going to cover today is the respiratory system. So let me go to class. Honey, let's get over there with that, please. Thank you.
Did you still want to do class over Zoom with her home?
Yeah, that's fine.
Since I'm the only one here.
Right. I mean, we'll see how it goes. If it ends
Okay.
up being a pain, I'll call it quits. But I think we'll be all right. As long as you can hear me, as long as her device isn't too loud. I know it was right by the mic a minute ago, so I'm hoping that you can hear me now better than you could a minute ago.
Oh, I didn't even hear her device at all.
Oh,
so.
okay. Good, because she was right by the laptop, so I thought it was probably picking up that sound of the cartoons more than me.
No, it actually wasn't. I didn't hear it.
Okay, good. So what I want to talk about today is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is divided into upper and lower, right? The biggest reason that we study the respiratory system is that that's how we get oxygen into our body. And so we need oxygen to make energy. We need oxygen for ATP. We have to get that oxygen into our body somehow, and that's through the respiratory system. Now, what we just studied was the cardiovascular system, which is a study of how we get that oxygen around our body, right? So we have to get it into our body, into our lungs, and then into our cardiovascular system. So the respiratory system's main function is really to get that oxygen into our body. Now, side effects, which are really cool. One is that we can produce sound using our respiratory system. We have our voice box in our throat, and when we pass air across our vocal cords, they vibrate like a guitar string, and that produces sound. Another really cool part of our respiratory system is the fact that we have a sense of smell, right? We have these receptors in our nose that when chemicals bind to them, they trigger the sense of smell, and it goes to our brain and triggers our sense of smell. But both of those are basically they're not the primary reason for the respiratory system, right? They're secondary reasons. So in order to study the respiratory system better, we divide it into an upper and lower. The upper respiratory system is everything from your voice box up. Okay, so not your voice box, but everything from there up. Your nose, your nasal cavity, your sinuses, your pharynx, which is the chamber behind your nose and your mouth. The lower respiratory system is your voice box down, including your voice box. That's your larynx. All right, and then the trachea is the tube below that, which branches into two tubes called bronchi that go into your lungs. And then there are all these little tubes inside your lungs that we'll talk about. Okay. So if we start at the top, right, we start with the upper respiratory tract. We have, all these structures. We have the nares or the nostrils. Those open into a nasal cavity. We have a vestibule, right, which is the space just inside the nose. The septum divides the nose. We have a hard palate and a soft palate, which is the roof of our mouth. So it's the bottom of our nasal cavity, right? And then posteriorly, our nasal cavity opens into a nasopharynx. So I skipped to this drawing on purpose. This drawing shows the upper respiratory tract, right? Here's our nose. So here's our nostril. This area just inside the nostril is called the nasal vestibule. These structures, if you remember from the skeletal system, those are the bones, the nasal conchae. So those are swirl-shaped bones, so that when we inhale air, it swirls this way, right? And that swirling helps to warm up the air, and that helps us to absorb oxygen from it. Behind your nasal cavity is your nasopharynx, okay? This whole big cavity behind your nose and your mouth, all the way down to the top of your voice box, is called the pharynx. And it's divided into three regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. There is nothing physically separating those three regions. The nasopharynx happens to be the area behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx happens to be the area behind the mouth. And the laryngopharynx is beneath both of those, inferior to both of those. Now, the problem is you have these two tubes that your laryngopharynx is open to. One is your esophagus, and one is your trachea, right? This tube here is this is your voice box, which ends up going to your trachea. So your esophagus goes down to your stomach. Your trachea goes down to your lung. This cavity is open to your mouth and your nose. So the problem we have is that we want to get air, which is coming through the nasopharynx, to go down your trachea. We want to get food and drink from your oropharynx to go down the esophagus, to get to your stomach. So you have this thing worked out, or the situation worked out, where you have a flap called an epiglottis. And epiglottis, you can see it here, is this blue structure. It is essentially a flap of cartilage. When you are swallowing food and drink, the epiglottis folds down, and in doing so, it covers up your larynx and your trachea, so that when you're swallowing food or drink, it's only going down your esophagus, right? You've covered up this tube. At the same time, this is your soft palate, right? The roof of your mouth. At the back of your soft palate, there's that structure called the uvula. I don't show it in here, but that structure looks like a punching bag that hangs down. That uvula moves back, moves up and back, and it blocks off the nasopharynx. So when you're swallowing food and drink, you're essentially holding your breath, right? You're blocking off your nasopharynx, so you can't get any air, because your brain can't figure out if you're getting air and you're trying to get that down your trachea and food and drink down your esophagus. What do, right? You get your wires crossed. Now, this works most of the time. We've all experienced probably a time or two when it doesn't. doesn't work correctly, you say, oh, I swallowed something down the wrong pipe, right? And you start coughing it up. What happens is generally you are trying to take a breath while you're swallowing food inadvertently or swallowing drink, and your brain doesn't know which way to go. And so some of that you swallow goes down your trachea, and you're trying to cough that out to keep that from getting down to your lungs. So when you say something went down the wrong pipe, it really did, right? Something actually went down the trachea instead of down the esophagus. So make sure that you know and understand the epiglottis and the fact that that just flops down and covers up your larynx and your trachea so that no food makes its way down there, no food or drink. Questions about that? We'll see that structure again in the next chapter, the digestive system. Obviously, it's doing the same thing in the digestive system. Just making sure that you're routing air and food and drink appropriately. Okay. So here's the anatomy of the larynx. The larynx is your voice box, right? So everything from here up is your upper respiratory tract. You can see the epiglottis here at the top of the larynx. That's going to cover up your larynx. Your larynx is composed of, this is where your vocal cords are. It's mostly composed of cartilage. All the blue stuff here is representing cartilage. This big wide part of cartilage is called thyroid cartilage. And that's what your Adam's apple is made of. Everybody has an Adam's apple. The growth of this cartilage is dependent on testosterone. And so when a boy hits puberty, that grows more and their vocal cords grow, and that's why their voice deepens. That's also why the Adam's apple is usually more prominent in a male than it is in a female, because males have more testosterone. Okay, hold on 1 second. Right, so the larynx, there's the anatomy of the larynx. You should know the epiglottis and know the thyroid cartilage. Right below the thyroid cartilage is a piece of cartilage called the cricoid cartilage. Make sure that you know that too. That's a smaller piece just before the trachea starts. And then the trachea has these rings of cartilage just to keep it rigid, right? Just to keep it some structure. So the vocal cords are in the larynx. They are inside the larynx. And there are some really cool videos, and I posted one on your Moodle page from a documentary. And what they do is they stick a camera down Steven Tyler's throat. And they have him singing different songs while this camera is down his throat. And what you can see are his vocal cords smashing together over and over again. And it gives you the understanding of how pitch is produced, how this noise is produced, because it's passing air across the vocal cords. So here's what you would see if you stick your camera down somebody's throat. So now this is looking down, right? This is looking from above down this structure. These are the vocal cords on either side of this hole. And so the trachea is directly below this. And so air is passing up through this and vibrating these vocal cords. And you can see when he sings in like really high pitched tones, the vocal cords are smashing together really, really fast in order to make that sound, in order to produce that sound. I think it's, a pretty cool video that shows this. Now, all this allows us to do is produce sound. What we do with that sound in our mouth is how we turn it into language, how we turn it into music, all that sort of thing. It's what you do, how you shape it with your mouth and your tongue and things like that. So those are the vocal cords, right? The larynx would come, or the epiglottis would come down and cover this up completely, so you wouldn't be able to see it. You can see the epiglottis in this upper picture, right? It's up. It's kind of coming out of the screen towards you, and it would flop down and cover that up. Okay. Then the last kind of part that I really want to get into are are about the lungs. The last part of the anatomy anyway that I want to get into is the lungs. Now the lungs, the trachea, as it travels down, it divides into two branches. One branch goes into each lung. Those branches are called bronchi, right? Those are the main branches. So there are two bronchi. There's a right and a left. And then, and so here you can see, right, the trachea divides to go into the right lung and the left lung. Then there are further divisions of this tube inside the lung. So this kind of gray purple shows where the lungs start. And those divisions happen further within the lungs. And the main bronchi divides into smaller branches called lobar bronchi. So those branch into tubes that supply each lobe of the lungs. Then each lobar bronchi branches further into segmental bronchi. So main, lobar, segmental. And then the segmental bronchi branch further into bronchioles. Bronchioles are the smallest little passageways. Okay, and the bronchioles have a lot of smooth muscle, and those are the ones that you can involuntarily, you can constrict or dilate. So depending on whether or not you need more air or less air, your body is constricting or dilating those. Sometimes, like if somebody has asthma, they usually have something that will trigger those to constrict, which makes it really hard to take air in. And that's why people have those rescue inhalers. What those inhalers do is they relax all that smooth muscle. So they allow for those bronchioles to open up so that you can get air in. Okay. Each bronchiole, they're called terminal bronchioles, and they end at respiratory bronchioles, which have a cluster on the end that look like a cluster of grapes called alveoli. Okay, so here is, right, here is a terminal bronchiole, and here are the alveoli, and you can see that they're surrounded by blood vessels. Oops. They are surrounded by capillaries. Now, the reason for that is the air that you breathe in, right, is going to end up in these grape-like clusters, these purple clusters. They are surrounded by capillaries because you need to get that air into capillaries, into your bloodstream. These clusters of grapes have a really, really thin wall around them, as thin as the wall around the capillaries. Remember, capillaries is where oxygen can get in and out of the blood. So you have this really thin wall surrounding the cluster of grapes, and you have a really thin wall surrounding all the capillaries. And what happens is oxygen diffuses from inside these clusters into the capillaries so that you get oxygen in those capillaries. It pumps blood back to the back to the left atrium of the heart. And that blood now has oxygen. It goes to the left ventricle and it goes to the systems of the body. Okay. So here's just another picture of those. Here you can see the alveoli are surrounded by these really thin epithelial cells. There are macrophages within the alveoli. So there are white blood cells in there just to fight off any infections that might get in there. And then there's these type 2 pneumocystes that secrete surfactants. But most of the cells are just these epithelial cells in there. So here's a picture of the lungs. We have 2 lungs. They are not equal. The right lung is bigger. The right lung contains 3 lobes. The left lung only 2. The left lung has this notch cut out of it, and that's for the heart, right? The heart sits in between these lungs, and it kind of sits toward the left side a little bit. The lungs are surrounded by a serous membrane called the pleural membrane. So serous membranes always have 2 layers, right? And the lungs have one layer that is covering the lungs and one layer that's lining the thoracic cavity. So that when you breathe and your lungs are moving, those two layers are moving against each other. It's not your lungs moving against your ribs. The layer that covers your lungs, the inner layer, is always the visceral layer. So that's called your visceral pleura. The outer layer is always called the parietal layer. So that's called the parietal pleura. So now when you breathe, the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura move against each other, right? And there's actually a layer in between them, a layer of fluid or a layer of, it's kind of like an oil, like a lubricating fluid, to keep them from building up friction. So here's a picture of a cross section through the chest, right? You can see the vertebrae. So this is the back. Here's the heart, right lung, the left lung. You can see how the left lung is a little bit smaller because the heart takes up some of that space. You can see behind them, right? You can see this is the esophagus. This is part of the aorta. Okay. So there's a few bits of terminology here. And there's this thing of external and internal respiration. So when I say respiration, pretty much everybody thinks of breathing, and that's fine. That is another term for breathing is respiration. But in biology, you can talk about external or internal respiration. External respiration is what happens in the capillaries surrounding your lungs. So in those capillaries surrounding your lungs, in external respiration, oxygen is going into the capillaries, carbon dioxide is coming out. Right? You want to exhale carbon dioxide. So you want carbon dioxide to go from the blood to your lung. And you want oxygen to go from your lungs to your blood. That blood then travels back through the left side of the heart to the body. And there's internal respiration in the different parts of the body. Internal respiration is oxygen out of your cardiovascular system and carbon dioxide into your cardiovascular system. Yeah. So make sure you know the difference between external and internal respiration. They're the opposite of each other, right? External is oxygen into the blood. Internal is oxygen out of the blood. They are just opposites of each other. Okay. So how does air move into our lungs? A lot of this has to do with just our pressure gradient. So pressure is inversely related to volume. What that means is if volume increases, pressure decreases. If volume decreases, pressure increases, right? They do the opposite. Now, you have your lungs. Your lungs are surrounded by muscles. When we inhale, our chest expands, and that pulls the lungs with it, right? Our diaphragm moves down, our rib cage expands. That makes our lungs bigger. So when we inhale, our lungs get bigger. Because the volume is increasing, the volume is getting bigger, the pressure inside is getting lower. Does that make sense? So pressure and volume are always inversely related, right? Volume gets bigger, pressure gets lower. What happens is now the pressure inside our lungs is lower than the pressure in the air around us. And air always wants to go from a high pressure to a low pressure. So air is always going to travel into our body, right? So when we inhale, we are using muscles to make our lungs bigger. And in making them bigger, we have actually decreased the pressure in them. And that allows us to draw air into our body. When we exhale, we relax those muscles and our lungs get a little bit smaller. And when our lungs get smaller, when that volume decreases, the pressure goes up. So when we exhale, our lungs get smaller. The pressure inside our lungs is greater than the pressure of the air outside around us. So the air travels from our lungs out to the atmosphere around us. That's what controls breathing, right? That's the reason that air goes into our lungs and that air exits our lungs. It's just that our lungs are changing size, which causes pressure changes. And that's kind of what all of these pictures are about. So they show at rest, and they show exhalation and inhalation. Right? When you inhale, your entire chest is going to expand, and that's going to cause the pressure inside your lungs to drop, and air is going to move in. So the reason I'm going over a lot of this is because this is partially what's going to be on your lab, or a lot of this will be on your lab. So in lab, what you'll do, or when you take your lab out, what you'll do is you have a mechanism that allows you to measure how much volume of air you can keep in your lungs. So you're breathing into this mechanism. It's really like a bag that's marked with markings on it. So you can see how much air, what volume of air you can exhale. And what you're trying to get to is to make sure that you can actually breathe a certain volume of air in order for you to get enough oxygen around your body and that sort of thing. So these are the terms that you'll be using in that experiment. Doctors usually want to figure out what your tidal volume is. Tidal volume is just the normal amount of air that moves in and out of your lungs during normal single respiratory breathing, like just normal quiet breathing, walking around, not thinking about it. How much air gets in and out of your lungs. You want to make sure that that's enough to get oxygen to the different parts of your body. The expiratory reserve volume and the inspiratory reserve volume, ERV and IRV. ERV is the amount of air you can push out past your tidal volume. So you're just walking around breathing normally. If you go past that, how much more air can you push out of your lungs? IRV is the amount of air that you can take in past your tidal volume. So again, you're taking in a normal amount of air. How much can you take in past that? If you add all those up, you add up your tidal volume, your normal breathing, how much you can expel after that, how much you can inhale after that, that equals your vital capacity. That's the maximum amount of air that you can keep in your lungs that can be moved in and out of your lungs, right? The normal volume plus what you can push out, plus what you can inhale past that, that's your vital capacity. That's the maximum amount. So if you were to take the deepest breath possible in, blow all of that out, that's your vital capacity, right? So tidal volume is your just normal everyday breathing in and out. Vital capacity is if you took the biggest breath in. Why can't I do that? There we go. All right. There are a few other things, right? There is residual volume. It's the amount of air remaining in your lungs after maximal exhalation. So even when I exhale as deeply as I can, even when I push all the air out that I can, there's still some air in my lungs, right? Because otherwise my lungs would collapse. That air that's in there is called residual volume. And you don't count that in gas exchange because it doesn't get in and out of your lungs. It's not getting into or out of your blood, right? It's just there to kind of keep your lungs from collapsing. The minimal volume is the amount of air remaining in your lungs after your lungs collapse. There's still a little bit of air in there. And the anatomic dead space, again, does not reach or take part in gas exchange. There's a certain amount of air that's just in those bronchi and bronchioles that doesn't go in or out, right? You don't have enough time to get that out or to get it back in. And so that's your anatomical dead space. It's kind of similar to the residual volume. Now, why am I going through all these different terms? Because part of what you're going to do with your experiment this week is you are going to be breathing into this bag and measuring different amounts of air that you can exhale. And from that, you're going to calculate some of the other numbers. Reason being because you can measure how much you can exhale, right? It's easy to breathe into something and see how much volume is there. Really hard to measure how much you can inhale, right? It's not set up that way. There's not an easy setup for that. So what you're going to do is get these numbers and kind of make a graph. And I'll post a separate thing kind of going over the lab portion tonight. But here is an example of a graph. So in the middle here, this red line is representing air moving in and out of your lungs. This in the middle, this curve here is your tidal volume. That's what normally moves into and out of your lungs every time you breathe. Right, and they're just going by averages for males or females. Right, these are just averages among the population. The amount of air you can push out past that tidal volume is expiratory reserve, ERV. The amount of air you can inhale past that tidal volume is inspiratory reserve. So this whole amount from the most you can inhale to the most you can exhale, that's called your vital capacity. Right? Now also realize that there is residual volume here at the bottom. Zero is all the way down here, right? They're not starting to measure anything until 1200 mils. That means that from 0 to 1200 is just residual volume, that there are 1200 mils of air in your lungs that don't go in or out, right? They just stay in your lungs. They're not traveling in and out every time you breathe. So a big part of the experiment that you do, they have you figure out, your tidal volume, your ERV, then you can calculate your IRV, then you calculate your vital capacity, and you answer some questions based on that. And again, I'll post the worksheet that goes with that, and I'll post a little explanation of that as well. So then gas transport in the blood, right? You want to talk about how gas is transported around in the blood. Well, oxygen and CO2 are transported a little bit differently. Oxygen, most of your oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, which is bound to red blood cells. So 98% of your oxygen, most of your oxygen binds to hemoglobin and travels bound to the red blood cells through your body. But only about 20% of carbon dioxide, they say 23% here, is bound to hemoglobin. About 70% is transported as bicarbonate ions. So most of the carbon dioxide, like we think of red blood cells as moving oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they move oxygen really well and they move some carbon dioxide. But a lot of carbon dioxide is actually is converted to carbonic acid, H2CO3, by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and it dissociates into H+ and HCO3 minus. Now, the significance of that is it keeps your blood pH constant. It serves as a buffer. This sodium bicarbonate serves as a buffer to keep your pH of your blood constant. Your blood pH needs to be about 7.35 to 7.45. Now, things that are acidic have more H's, okay, more H pluses. Things that are basic have less of the H pluses. If your blood starts to become very acidic, what's going to happen is the HCO3 minus is going to bind to the extra H pluses that are in your blood and bring that pH back up towards 7.35. If your blood becomes very basic, this will dissociate and you will end up with more H pluses, and more H pluses will bring the pH of your blood back down towards 7.35. So a huge part of the carbon dioxide in your body, and carbon dioxide is produced as we are making ATP. So as we're making energy, we're producing carbon dioxide. We're getting rid of, we're breathing out, exhaling about 20% of that. But about 70% of it is actually getting converted by this enzyme into carbonic acid, and it is buffering the pH of our blood. It is responsible for making sure that our blood pH stays in that 7.35 to 7.45 range. So how do we control respiration? Respiration is voluntary and involuntary, right? Most of the time it's involuntary. Most of the time you're not thinking about it. There are involuntary respiratory centers. They are in our brain stem, which is at the back of our brain. So our pons and our medulla oblongata. And those are setting the respiratory rate. Okay, and they are responding to things that are, they're responding to things like how much CO2 we have in our body, in our blood, how much oxygen we have in our blood, right? And they are changing our respiratory rates based on that. You also have voluntary control of your respiratory center, right? We can take a deep breath in, we can exhale. You don't normally think about exhaling, right? You don't think about exhaling all the time, but you can blow out extra air. And those voluntary centers reside in the cerebral cortex, so we can override our involuntary centers. You can hold your breath, right? You can go underwater, you can hold your breath for a certain amount of time. And then it gets, a lot of these chapters go into age. The respiratory system is less efficient when you get older, for a couple of reasons. One reason is because a lot of inhaling has to do with muscle contraction, and our muscles don't move as well as we get older, right? We get arthritic changes, our ribs get arthritic, the muscles get weaker. Also, the alveoli, the little grape-like clusters, get damaged during a person's lifetime. So just from breathing in and out millions of times throughout the years, they start to get more and more damage over their lifetime. And so because they're damaged, things like scar tissue build up, and there's less of a place for the air to exchange or the gas to get across that surface into our blood vessels. It does work with all the other systems. One of the things I always try to, make sure that you understand from teaching A&P is that, yes, we study all these systems separately, but this is supplying oxygen to all the other systems of the body, right? So it has to work with our cardiovascular system to get the oxygen to all the systems of the body. And, every system needs oxygen to make ATP. Every system, when they're making ATP, is also producing carbon dioxide. And this is how we're getting rid of carbon dioxide. It's very closely linked with the nervous system because that's how we control our respiration. So there are all these systems that are linked together. So even though we study them separately, I just want to make sure that you know that they're linked together. So I'm going to stop there. Again, I am going to post the modified kind of syllabus that I've done for the next 2 weeks. My plan Friday is to go over the digestive system. And then next Wednesday and Friday, we'll go over the urinary and reproductive systems. After Friday's class, I'll post the exam that will be covering the respiratory, digestive, urinary, reproductive systems. It's going to cover 4 systems, your final exam. It will be posted on December 17th, and you'll have until the 22nd to complete that. As far as labs go, starting today, you can do your respiratory physiology lab, which came in that lab kit. And there's a sheet that goes with that has you, fill out a couple tables to figure that out. I'll make sure that's posted on Moodle. I think it's there, but I want to check and make sure it's there. That will be due by next Tuesday night at midnight, so before next Wednesday's class. And then the next lab that we'll do is dissecting the pig, because you can see the digestive system, the urinary system, and the reproductive systems in the pig. So that will be done over the next week at some point, and there'll be, I'll post a place where you can have pictures and everything in Moodle. So those will be our last 2 labs as well. Okay. So, do you have any questions?
Not at the moment.
Alright.
So you said that, wait, you said you're gonna put up a sheet we fill out for the respiratory lab?
Yes, yep, there's a
Okay,
sheet
so
that
we
goes
just fill it
along with
out?
it that says like, find this volume, record it here, that kind of thing.
Okay,
I know that I have it, I'm not sure if it's up on Moodle or not, so I'll make sure it is.
okay. I printed everything out, so I have the fetal dissection.
Okay,
So I didn't see that, but I'll look again just in case. You, like you said, you might not have loaded it up.
right.
All right.
So, Steve, we're gonna get the demo for that lab.
Yes, yep, I'll post I'll post a demo for the dissection. I don't think I have a demo for the respiratory, but if I don't, I'll try to find one. If I don't, I can record a little something. It's basically just breathing into a tube. You've got a tube with markings on it, and you breathe into it, and so you can see how much air you've inhaled or exhaled into the tube, and those are the things that you're going to use for your calculations.
Okay.
So that's like doing the lab's like doing a pulmonary function test, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's just a makeshift spirometer, right?
Yeah.
In a hospital, you'd have a nicer spirometer with a gauge on it and everything.
I've done one. That's the thing is I found my results from before, so I want to see like if the
Oh, there you
makeshift
go.
one matches the results that I had done. So that's why I was
Yeah.
like, if that's what it is. It's just a makeshift pulmonary function test.
Yeah, yep, exactly. It's just trying to figure out if, how much air you can get in and out of your lungs. If that's close to the average, then it's pretty sufficient for what you need.
So what is it like they say is residual volume?
Mhm.
What is that? Like the output or input? Like
Residual volume doesn't go in or out. Residual
that?
volume is just always in your lungs. So no matter how much you exhale, you can't exhale all the air out of your lungs. Your lungs
Okay.
would collapse. And so there's a certain amount of volume that's in there. Now, the reason they call it residual is because it doesn't go in and out when you breathe, right? So you're not breathing out CO2 and breathing in oxygen for that portion, for that volume. It's just
Okay.
staying in your lungs. You're just keeping your lungs expanded.
Oh, okay. So it's just like leftover air in your lungs, basically.
Right. So it doesn't
Residual.
participate in gas exchange at all. It just stays in there and keeps your lungs expanded.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm excited to do this. I might do it
Good.
today.
Cool.
Once you post that stuff up, I might go do it tonight.
Cool. Excellent.
No. Alrighty.
All right, guys.
All right. Is that it for today?
That's it for today.
Well, have fun with your little one.
And-
Oh, thank you. Let me
Okay,
know if
thank
guys
you.
have
I think mine
I
wants to
came
play with her
later.
ball.
Aw. What was it, Peter? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm saying I came late. I had a doctor's appointment.
Right.
Yeah, it was starting at 9 o'clock, so I did not know how long it's gonna take, but
Okay.
at least I made it. Yeah.
Made
Yeah. I appreciate it. And so, I mean, just go back, I guess, and watch some of this video, if you need to, if you want to. But like I said, I'm going to post the syllabus for the next 2 weeks so that everybody knows, what our plan is for the next 2 weeks. And we'll go from there.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
thank
All right.
you.
Well, everybody have a good day. Be careful. It's supposed to snow. I don't know
Yeah.
wherever you're at. So
Exactly. You
I'm
too.
hunkered down doing homework all day.
Nice.
All right.
All
Bye,
right.
guys.
Bye.
Okay.